the climate crisis is really a human crisis, which means that how you experience it really depends on who you are, but also where you live. And people that have been forced to flee are particularly vulnerable.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Today's episode is produced in partnership with the CGIAR Research Initiative on Fragility, Conflict, and Migration for a series that examines what works to improve the well-being of people in fragile and conflict-affected settings. CGIAR is a global partnership that unites international organizations engaged in research about food security. We are calling this series From Fragility to Stability. And in today's episode, I host a roundtable discussion with three experts about how to escape the nexus of climate change, conflict, and forced displacement. You'll hear from Jana Birner, Associate Partnerships Officer in the Office of the Special Advisor on Climate Action for the UN Refugee Agency, Barthelemy Mwanza, who is a refugee from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who works with the Global Refugee Youth Network, and Alessandro Craparo, a bioclimatologist with CGIAR. To access this episode and other episodes that are part of this series, please visit globaldispatches.org. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone. I am really excited for our conversation today. Just to kick off, can I have everyone introduce themselves so the audience can put a voice to a name? Jana, we'll start with you.
My name is Jana Birner. I work for UNHCR in the Office of the Special Advisor on Climate Action, and I'm an Associate Partnership Officer, meaning that I mostly work with academic institutions and work on everything related to data, climate change, and forced displacement.
My name is Barthelemy Mwanza. I work with the Global Refugee Youth Network as the Refugee Youth-led coordinator.
Hi, my name is Alessandro Craparo, and I'm a bioclimatologist with CGIAR.
Barth, I wanted to start with you. Can you share more about your experience of displacement? In particular, how has climate change impacted your life in the Tongoghara refugee settlement in Zimbabwe?
I'm originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I left my home country in 2012 due to tribal war, which led me to leave my home country and come to Tongoghara refugee settlement. There, I had to spend around 11 years before being resettled to the United States. Then when I arrived there, I found that there was a climate change. For example, there were some cyclones which were hitting the camp, and there was too much sun affecting even the health of many people. It was really affecting us a lot because I could see that so many houses were damaged, and sometimes those, when it absorbs water, sometimes we couldn't even be in a position to close. Hence, people will be forced even to sleep without closing the door, because otherwise, when you are trying to force to close the door, then you are trying to demolishing your house by force. And then this as well, it's also affected food, because I know there are so many refugees who had at least some plots where they could plant maize, they could plant beans. But when there's this cyclone, it could affect, and even when it comes time to collect to collect beans, you'll see that they won't really collect the good quantity. And it also even affected the movement, like how can you move around the camp? It affected business. For example, my sister had a business, she was selling a few things in the market. But with this, it was really hard for her even to go to the market. that's how at least this climate change, it really affected me particularly, and it affected also the camp. And I could see even some people like whenever it's about to rain, you will see people like going quickly, covering their houses with plastics. It wasn't really making our life stable.
Yeah, I mean, you've identified everything from like harvesting to just the ability to withstand rain from your house and open a door during a rainstorm as like really some of the key challenges of climate change on that refugee settlement. What, on the flip side, options do you see to improve the situation for displaced communities? And what are some of the gaps and key challenges and needs to perhaps make a refugee settlement like Tongoro more resilient to climate change?
When we talk about this Tongoga refugee settlement, first of all, it's a climate hotspot here because when it's sunny, so that means it's sunny, and you'll see many people even getting blood pressure. Why? Because of sun. And even sometimes, even you'll see even the way of thinking, it's going like to change. You feel like, you are psychologically affected. Why? Like it's really sunny. So what needs to be done? First of all, the place, it's not really a good place because whenever there are cyclones, any disaster, so we'll be advised to move to highlands. So I think the good thing is just for refugees at least to be moved from that climate hotspot to highlands. Yeah, and then with this, we know that at least even if there's any disaster, we know that some people can even be in their homes and it won't affect their houses, it won't affect their house. And also, there's need to build a strong infrastructure because I know the one that we have. And sometimes there are some people who are calling them like biscuits. Why? Because when it rains a lot, for example, for the whole day, 2 days, 3 days, when it could rain, so you will see that at least we are going to count at least some houses which are going to be damaged, and we are going even to count some toilets which are going to collapse, I can say. I think there's also needs to support also refugee-led organizations working at least, to address climate change. So I think with this, at least they will be able at least to continue with their work in preventing, in responding, and are going to participate also in the early warning. And I think it's also good to equip young people with the right skills. Yeah, because I know sometimes there are some workshops which are being organized like at the national level. So at least if we are part of these workshops, we communicate, we work together with other organizations led by young people. So I think that could also be fine.
So, Jana, Barth just described his experience in, one refugee camp in Zimbabwe. I wanted to have you address like global trends, zoom out a little bit, and have you just identify and describe some of the global trends that we're seeing in terms of climate and displacement.
What we're seeing in terms of trend is that the number of forcibly displaced people in the world has never been higher. We reached over 120 million people living in displacement in June 2024, which means that we're seeing almost a doubling of displacement numbers over the past 10 years. And now 1 in every 67 people globally is living in displacement. So the numbers are high and they are only going to increase. What we're also seeing is that the impacts of climate change are exacerbating existing drivers of displacement, both within but also across international borders. So, for example, extreme weather events can displace people. Over the past 10 years, just to give you a number here, we had approximately 60,000 displacements per day triggered by weather-related extreme events, which is in addition to the 120 million people that I already mentioned. And this type of displacement can be short-term, but it can also be protracted, and it always has devastating consequences for the individuals experiencing it. What we also have to acknowledge, though, is that climate change does not act in a vacuum. So all conflicts that we're seeing taking place on this earth at the moment are all happening in a changing climate, which also means that climate change can play a role and can, under certain circumstances, exacerbate the drivers of conflict. It's not a linear relationship, so it doesn't mean that climate change is directly causing conflict, but it can, for example, increase tensions over already scarce resources and intensify them. So climate change is just adding another layer of complexity to already very complex crises that we're seeing at the moment. And with regards to trends, Over the coming decades, of course, we're expecting that climate-related hazards are going to increase, and we're actually working with CGIAR, with Sandra, who's here with us today as well. So now we know that around 90 million people that are living in displacement are living in climate-related hotspots. So they experience high to extreme exposure to climate-related hazards in countries like Sudan, Syria, but also the DRC, Lebanon. And I think Bar's story really underlines what this means for an individual life. We know the trends, but really a lot still depends on actions we can take today, and there's still solutions that we can take to prevent these devastating realities.
Sandro, I wanted to turn to you now and ask you about climate science and the interaction with conflict.
It's a really interesting and complex situation. So climate has, and extremes in particular, has increased rapidly over the past couple of years and certainly decades. Take the last decade, for instance, this has been the hottest in the last 125,000 years. So we're definitely in new territory. If we just look at last year, for example, 2023, essentially pretty much every single day, or at least every month since July, broke a new record onwards till December. So we're really in a new space. And when we consider other hazards in combination with climate, so for example, conflict, we can really see that there's a new space in which we haven't interacted before. And that space is incredibly different in each place on the ground. As Barth had mentioned earlier, him and his family were displaced by conflict and are then subsequently exposed to climate hazards. So, number one, all of these incidences are increasing and co-occurring. And number two, they don't occur the same way in each place. So we're really at a space in which we need to apply as much information as possible, but it's incredibly difficult. And that's where relationships, partnerships, data, and advisory and information on the ground from people like Bath and from those having lived these experiences is incredibly important.
So, Jana, I wanted to turn back to you. What are the key gaps and challenges in terms of better addressing forced displacement and protection?
So what we have to understand at the core is that the climate crisis is really a human crisis, which means that how you experience it really depends on who you are, but also where you live. And people that have been forced to flee are particularly vulnerable. What that means in practice is that they have challenges in accessing climate resilient sustainable services to really meet their daily needs, which could be water, it could be food, it could be energy, but it could also be shelter, as Barth has already said as well. And at the same time, what we are seeing is that the capacities for people that have been forced to flee to adapt to climate change are limited because often they have limited freedom of movement. They don't have the same amount of social safety nets as citizens, and there might even be restrictions in terms of shelter, which then means in total that they often experience higher level of vulnerability, that marginalization is further increased, and that a lot of protection challenges are arising, especially in fragile or conflict-affected settings. Within these communities, women and girls are often disproportionately affected, as well as people with disabilities, but also elderly people, because they might have additional needs that are not catered for in existing response strategies to climate change. So just to give you an example, in evacuation situations where people evacuate because we know an extreme climate event is going to happen, like a cyclone, women might not be able to evacuate because they could face additional GBV risks, gender-based violence risks, in evacuation centers. So there are situations where they are choosing to stay behind and are enduring these disasters just because they can't expose themselves to these additional risks. And then lastly, climate change can obviously drive displacement, as we already discussed, but it can also challenge durable solutions, which basically means it can make it harder for people to return to their countries of origin because they are experiencing increasing climate hazards. But they can also have challenges to locally integrate because it's harder for people to become self-sufficient if extreme weather events are hitting again and again.
So, Barth, Jana just had a great quote. She said, climate crisis is a human crisis. Does that resonate with you and your experiences? And looking ahead, how does that resonate with your current initiatives as well as a refugee youth leader?
When there's a climate change, refugees are just remaining vulnerable because they are just moving from one place to another. They are just remaining like homeless without any place to survive. Because at some point, even when you were in Tongogara refugee settlements, whenever there are cyclones, you will see like people looking at least for ways maybe to move. At some point also, I heard you talk about conflict. At some point, you will see that even the accessibility of water it's really becoming a problem, like the shortages of water. And, when there will be so many people trying to get at least water, there will be even some conflict there because everyone will need to go at least with one container of water. And even for these most vulnerable people, like people with disability, elderly people, yes, women, these are the people at least who are affected. I remember even during the cyclone Idai, my sister, kids, like they remain home. But it's now my brother-in-law who are supposed not to go and look for the vehicle which would take us to Harare, which is, another city at least where we could be at least safe. When it comes now to the actions, as a young leader with other refugee leaders in Tongogara refugee settlements, they came up with so many initiatives to address this climate change. For example, there's the tree planting, making sure that they plant trees, since there are some people like who usually cut the trees because what we use to cook and everything, we use charcoals or firewood because there is no other ways for us to cook. Like since at least not everyone has electricity at home. Then there's also climate education, to educate the community through focus group discussions, like taking kids and trying at least to educate them so that they mobilize their parents on how at least to maintain the environment clean. And also we organize as well sports for climate action. So we do sports, and then during those activities we at least make sure that we give everyone at least some education. And as I mentioned also about food insecurity, to address this, there are also some refugee-led organizations coming up with initiatives to create like garden where they plant vegetables, so that in case of any disaster, at least we will be able even to go in the garden and pick a few vegetables. And there are also some who are addressing climate change by doing waste management. For example, there's a refugee-led organization called Transformation Innovation Hub. They came up with an initiative of building a house made of plastic bottles. And there are also some as well who are mitigating climate change by installing solar panels on refugee-led organizations so that they will be able to use their computers and to charge as well. These are a few initiatives that refugee youth-led organizations are running in the camp. And also, as a leader working with the Global Refugee Youth Network, I'm trying at least to use my connection since I'm outside of the camp to find ways to fund their initiatives so that they can be able to run sustainably their project.
Jana, from like a high level, can you list any solutions to many of the problems that we've discussed here today? And in particular, identify how and why partnerships are key to devising and implementing some of those solutions?
I think what we have to realize is that really solutions are out there and they are working. And I think Bath just really showed us that they are also working on the local level. However, the work that we're doing at the moment, the business as usual, humanitarian response, but also development response, is just not adequate with the challenges that we're facing. So it's really a choice because we know the trends, we know the data, we know that the situation will only get worse from a climate standpoint. So we really have to start acting now. In terms of solutions, I think what we have to do first is really to put affected communities, displaced communities, front and center to everything that we're doing. We need to make their voices heard. We need to have people like Bath participating in decision-making processes such as the COP, and we need to acknowledge their solutions and their expertise in order to make them sustainable. And therefore, for example, also invest in education, invest in capacity building, and just scaling up these local solutions that refugee-led networks and individuals are spearheading across the world already. What we have to do as well is we have to invest in inclusion. So we have to invest to make sure that refugees are included in all the existing systems that citizens are included in. So, for example, in social protection systems, but also in climate adaptation work, in early warning work, in anticipatory action, but also in policy discussions like the COP and related processes. So, for example, countries are developing their national adaptation plans and their national determined contributions, which are basically laying out all related programming that they're going to do for climate action. And if refugees and displaced communities aren't explicitly included in these strategies, they may also be excluded in their implementation, but also in the financing decisions. And here we actually have a best practice example of what could work, because last year UNHCR has been working with IGAD, which is a intergovernmental body in Eastern Horn of Africa. And together with them, we developed a regional climate adaptation strategy that has been inclusive. And because it was regional, it was able to way better address transboundary issues, like, for example, displacement. Another solution is that we really have to scale up investments in resilience and adaptation, especially in fragile and conflict-affected settings, before people are so vulnerable that they are forced to flee. So we kind of have to get ahead of disasters and focus on preparedness and stabilization. And for that, we need better evidence, we need forecasting tools, we need trends analysis, and we need partnerships. For example, what we're doing with CGIAR at the moment, they're really enhancing our capacity to understand climate data, because our traditional expertise is really protection, it's displacement, we work in fragile and conflict-affected settings, but we are not climate experts as UNHCR. So complementing each other's expertise in these settings is really key. And then lastly, obviously, we need to increase accessible, available, but also affordable climate finance. We have to acknowledge the generosity that a lot of refugee hosting states are providing and providing protection to so many people. For example, countries like Chad that are really at the forefront of the climate crisis, but at the same time, they are keeping the doors open and are accepting people that have been forced to flee from the Sudan crisis. But we also must make sure that finance really reaches the local level, including for displacement settings. And at the moment, what we're seeing is that even climate finance is not really reaching fragile states, but even if it does reach fragile states, only 10% gets channeled to the local level. And that's why we have to start working way more with refugee-led organizations, with local actors, and invest in localization.
So, Sandro, Jana describes some challenges at the global level and Barth at the very local level. I'm interested in learning from you how climate data science and the importance of co-development can address some of these challenges.
Really important in this case is we really have to understand the situation on the ground. Coming from a science perspective, we often work at a higher level, at a global level. And so our spatial and our temporal scales don't necessarily always match up with what we find on the ground. And so that kind of co-development is really critical in these cases, not only with other organizations such as UNHCR, but also with people on the ground. And this type of information, so this kind of indigenous knowledge, is incredibly valuable. It's incredibly useful, and often it's superior to science and has a place within co-development. So we really need to put together what we have in terms of climate data and analyses and combine that with what we see on the ground, with the examples, with the knowledge, with the solutions and the adaptation that Barth has mentioned, together with the work that UNHCR do in terms of protection, and build that in so that we're able to develop some sort of solutions and increase mitigation and protection. We also need to tweak our data and information. So often, and in this particular case, in terms of climate science, we typically work within, say, ecosystems, crops, plants, and these types of earth systems. But although humans are incredibly incorporated or incredibly vested within these systems, we're different. So we need to then tweak our data and our information so that it's more relevant for humans. That's what we've been doing over the last two years with UNHCR and other partners, so that this information is more relevant. Take heat, for example. We know the kinds of thresholds or the levels at which, say, certain crops or plants are able to work within, the ranges at which they're happy to exist. But if we take that kind of information and try and apply it to humans, of course, it's fairly different. And so this is one of the examples of what we've done is, instead of looking at, say, just temperature, we know that humidity is incredibly important to humans as well. And so, as Barth was mentioning, I mean, many of the camps, extreme heat is just intolerable. And so what we had developed is certain types of variables or indices which combine heat and humidity. And in that way, we get a kind of real feel temperature or real feel heat. And there we can understand at what points this starts becoming detrimental or lethal to humans. And so putting all this information together and also understanding the kind of co-occurrence of these events is critical. So what we find within increasing climate change is that you won't just have, say, a heat event, but often this is combined with droughts or floods. And those can either occur together or they can also follow each other in really close sequence. And in those cases, of course, you don't just get the impact from one of these events, but these become magnified. And this is where we start to get really impactful situations. And of course, when that co-occurs with other hazards beyond just climate, say, for example, conflict, we will start to see major impacts on the ground.
Barth, could you just elaborate further on why it's important to provide funding for community-led organizations like yours? And what do you see more broadly as the role of youth in climate action?
So I think refugee-led organizations should not be seen as a recipient of assistance, but they should be able at least to take the lead, be independent, and actively address the needs that are important to their communities. Because at some point, if we are just remaining as a recipient of assistance, so that means we are not really creating a sustainable solution. So I see most of the time when there are cyclones happening in the settlement, Ungara refugee settlement, so you will see that most of stakeholders, they are going to run away like from the place. They're going to join their families in cities. And then we are the ones like refugees who are going to remain behind. So we know the problems that you are facing. We know what are the solution to bring. So that means like with these initiatives, we really definitely need to support these refugee-led organizations so that they will be able to address the problems and then come up with the solutions. And there are so many initiatives, for example, like planting trees, for example, like doing the gardening project that address like food insecurity. So if we are able to support them financially, we are able to support them with capacity building, sometimes it's going to help them to be sustainable. Like our Global Refugee Youth Network, what we do, we usually support with short-term funding, like only for 3 months. But you will see that the result that these refugee-led organizations are going to do, like it's going to be really huge. But now, if we can provide flexible funding, long-term funding, so that means it's going to create the impact. So when it comes now to the role of young people in climate change, so I think taking at least the practical example of Tonga refugee settlements, whenever there's a disaster which is about to happen, I know stakeholders usually send us message so that we can share with the community. So we use WhatsApp with the phone, and maybe if it is relative in the camp and share with the population, we do that. And we can also do that to support like with the response. For example, as I talked about houses being damaged, so it's only young people who will be there trying to reconstruct and making sure at least they support even those who were affected. And we also do some initiatives to prevent, for example, like doing awareness campaigns, as I said, organize focus group discussions, at least to be able to educate the population. So I can really see that refugee-led organizations, young people are really participating in responding to climate change, in preventing and in the early warning.
Well, Barth, Jana, Sandra, thank you so much for your time today. This was great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot to you for the invitation.
Very much appreciate the time.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.